With Scream 7 on the horizon this month, it's time to go back through the series. Let's review all the Scream films in the lead up to its release, starting with the OG, the original Wes Craven Scream from 1996. Let's dive in on a classic. What's happening? What's happening? What's happening? Welcome back into JC's Movies, where you can see all kind of movie and TV show talk with me, JC, especially within the superhero, comedy, and horror genres as we're talking today as we get set to dive into our Scream review series here to lead up to the release of Scream 7. If that sounds like it's up your alley, be sure you hit that subscribe button. That way you can get these videos directly into your feed, stay up to date on the movie news, get these reviews as we lead up to Scream 7 as I'll go through the entire series. And of course, every weekday I'm putting out movie news here with Movie News Daily, Monday through Friday. So if you're a fan of movies and TV shows, you want to talk them with me, come here, hit that subscribe button. I'd really appreciate that as I continue to try and grow the channel here on YouTube. And you can also help me out just by hitting that thumbs up button. Giving this video a like helps it a ton with that YouTube algorithm, helps it hit that thing and find more movie fans like you and me. And we're going to get set to dive into Scream. Obviously, spoilers abound, but I mean, movie's 30 years old now at this point. So if you haven't seen it, I don't know if you're going to, but if you want to see it and you haven't yet, go watch it before you check out this review because I'm going to spoil the hell out of it. But that being said, you know, I could wax poetic about this thing forever. I don't want to go on too long before we get into the plot and I run through kind of my thoughts there, but just incredible stuff from Wes Craven. Kevin Williamson, you know, I love Kevin Williamson's writing abilities with this Scream movie. They're definitely on full display. Wes Craven, you know, kind of reinvented the horror genre not once but twice. Originally with, you know, Nightmare on Elm Street, you know, bringing his own slasher to the mix that, you know, could talk, which was different than, you know, a lot of the other slashers. And then, of course, here with Scream in the late 90s, slashers were kind of on their last leg. They were a thing of the past. They, you know, almost become a joke, you could say, at this point. And then he revitalized the entire genre, the slasher genre, the horror genre, both alike there with what he did with Scream. The meta angle, you know, the fact that it's a horror movie that knows it's a horror movie and knows that you know that you're watching a horror movie. All of those things just make this movie so great, so incredible. I'm sure I'll wax poetic about it enough as we go through the plot here, but just kind of wanted to get that off my chest because I think that deserves mentioning. I think it definitely, you know, Kevin Williamson's writing deserves credit for sure because he, you know, wrote this on his own. And then, of course, Wes Craven's directing brought it to life. And then, of course, throughout the franchise, continued on up until that fifth movie with Wes Craven at the helm and Kevin Williamson involved for most of them. Of course, Scream 3 being the exception. We'll get there eventually. But I think, you know, both those two were a match made in heaven. I think especially with this original Scream, you probably have the best cast of any Scream movie. And not to say that there's not some good cast in the other, you know, movies in the franchise as well. There definitely is. But it was just like that perfect mix, that lightning in a bottle, if you will, with this cast, with the way that this thing played out. And, you know, I could go on and on, but let's just get into it. Let's talk about the plot. Let's get into the movie. Let's get into some Scream spoilers and let's review this classic. All right, so let's lead off with talking about the opening because to me, this is one of the best openings in horror history. I think the only one I'd probably put above it would be Halloween, in my opinion. I mean, there's some others that are up there for debate, but multiple things that make this, you know, a great opening. I think not the least of which is kind of, I guess you could call it a stunt casting. They bring in Drew Barrymore. You know, her face was the only face that was on the Scream poster back in 96. And she was by far, you know, the top build. So, you know, you go into this movie in 96 and you think you're going to see a movie with Drew Barrymore as the final girl, as the lead actress in this movie. And the balls by Wes Craven and them to, you know, cast her just to kill her off in the opening act. And shout out to Drew Barrymore for being willing to be a part of that. I'm sure she was paid well for it. But that right there is a great fake out in and of itself right from the beginning. You was not expecting Drew Barrymore to die originally, you know, when you first see this movie, I'm sure, especially if you were seeing it back when it premiered back in 96. Of course, I didn't see it, you know, till the mid 2000s myself because, you know, I was 3 years old in 96. So, you know, take that for what it will. I didn't watch my first horror movie until, you know, 4 or 5 years after that. But when I finally did see Scream, I was like, oh, that's Drew Barrymore. She's one of the main characters in this probably. Even then, I was caught off guard by, oh, wow, you know, she dies right here in the opening. But not only that, just the things that take place in the opening. I mean, referencing so many classic horror movies was so original at the time. That had never been done. You know, she answers the phone. She mentions Halloween. She grabs a butcher knife out of the knife block when she mentions Halloween. Just little nods like that that hadn't been done before. You were a horror movie on your own, but you weren't referencing other movies within the genre. Scream kicked that off and kind of made that a thing moving forward. And of course, they also reference Nightmare on Elm Street, which I always get a kick out of, because if you go watch this movie, when they mention Nightmare on Elm Street, Drew Barrymore says, "Oh, the first Nightmare on Elm Street was good, the rest sucked." And that's definitely Wes Craven throwing a dig at the franchise, because he was, only involved with that first one, and then, wasn't a big fan of where they took it from there on out. Not saying I necessarily agree with that, because actually, Part 3 Dream Warriors is probably my favorite Nightmare on Elm Street movie, but I still get a kick out of that dig right there from Wes Craven when he mentions, Nightmare on Elm Street, when he's running through these classic horror franchises. But, so you get kind of that referential stuff, that meta stuff, which, wasn't a term until after Scream, meta horror and meta, all that stuff. So you're already, you're intrigued, you're enjoying it. You're like, oh man, this movie's referencing other horror movies. You get some great bits of dialogue back and forth there, and you're already entertained by that. And then you start to get some of the brutality, some of the horrific moments right there. Like the first one that always sticks out to me is, she's on the phone and it's just kind of cheeky up to this point. And then you hear him say, "I want to know who I'm looking at." And she's like, "What?" He says, "I want to know who I'm talking to." But just that one little line right there is such a good nod of, oh man, this is getting creepy now, from there. Because at the beginning, you're like, is this just a prank call? Is this movie opening with a prank call? When the first time you see it, you really don't know. And then you get to that point and you're like, oh no, this is about to go dark. And then that is officially driven home, because, she kind of gets creeped out by that, hangs up the phone. It rings again. She answers, which, shout out to landlines as well. I mean, some of you younger viewers may not remember that, but I remember those days. But nonetheless, she answers, and you get the line, "Hang up on me again and I'll gut you like a fish." And you're like, oh, okay, this just took a turn. This things might get brutal, moving forward here. And that's what I love about this movie. It can, at the same time, be cheeky, have some fun, deliver some laughs, but that horrific element, that brutality, that gore, that dark side, it's still there. It's still ever present throughout this movie. And continuing on with this phone call, you get kind of the first moment of something that would continue to be a theme throughout this movie. And that's it calling out, the horror tropes. It was kind of the first one to ever call out the horror tropes. Hey, we know what you expect from horror movies, these things right here. And, we're going to let you know that we know that about them. Just kind of that tongue-in-cheek aspect to it was really cool. One of the first moments of that was she's back on the phone and she's, here's a bang. She says, "Who's there?" And, the killer, Ghostface on the phone says, "Never say who's there. It's a death wish. You may as well come out here and investigate a strange noise or something." And just that line right there was so clever, because you're watching the movie and you're like, oh man, that always does happen in horror movies. They ask who's there. They go outside and investigate a strange noise, all of those things. And this movie was calling them out. And you're like, man, that's really smart and really cool that a horror movie is telling you, hey, this is what happens in horror movies. It was just different. It was innovative. It was, all of those things. Super smart writing from Kevin Williamson. Right there with that script and some of those lines of dialogue that you get here. And of course, that continues throughout the movie. And of course, the horror movie references continue when Ghostface gets into essentially the horror movie trivia, which was such a good touch, especially, when he gets to, the question that eventually, throws her off with the Friday the 13th trick question, if you will, when he asks who was the killer in Friday the 13th. Because even watching this movie for the first time, I was, in my head saying, oh, Jason's obviously the killer in Friday, the Friday the 13th series. But no, it's his mother. His mother was the killer in the original movie. And that right there, just even that was so clever to know that not only would that catch most people off guard, so, it works in the movie, but as far as the audience is concerned, sometimes, you probably the first time you watch that movie, you're like, oh, he's right. It was, Jason's mom in the original Friday the 13th. It was Mrs. Voorhees. Spoiler alert for, a 1980 Friday the 13th movie. But if you've seen this, that's coming. And I thought that was super clever writing there from Kevin Williamson to try and find a question that would, trick this person on the phone, but also might have most of the audience be like, oh yeah, that's true. That type of moment right there was just, well written yet again. But even if you don't feel like that's a trick question, the Friday the 13th question, the final question that, Casey Becker, Drew Barrymore's character, gets asked here in the opening is the ultimate trick question, what you won't learn until later, because Ghostface asks, what door am I at? And knowing what we know about the ending of the movie, as, pretty much every movie in Scream, except for I think one, has multiple killers, multiple ghost face, which this was the trend that this movie would start. Either way she answered that question would have been wrong. There was no way for her to get that question right. And that's something you don't realize until, you see this movie for the first time and go back in hindsight and watch it. And you're like, oh, yep, that there was no way for her to survive this. It was going to end the way that it ended regardless. And so you go from, that cheeky exchange on the phone to then it's starting to get serious with, of course, her boyfriend, getting killed and all of that. But to me, this opening is really driven home by, a couple of things. And one is, Casey seeing her parents pull up. Because, when you see the parents pull up, you think, oh, my parents are here. I'm going to be fine. I'm going to be okay. All of that, as we all would. If our parents pulled up, we're in danger. Okay, my parents are here. I'm going to be fine. And you kind of feel that in the movie. You almost kind of exhale when you see her parents pulling up. But it doesn't make a difference. And I thought that was such a nice touch. And then the brutality and the horrific element are really driven home when, her mom picks up the phone to call the police. And of course, Casey has the phone, but her vocal cords have been crushed. She can't scream or anything. But her mom has to hear her essentially, getting murdered on the other end of the phone. And you're like, damn, that's dark. That's brutal. And then, of course, she goes outside. She's strung up on the tree, guts that are supposed to be on the inside or on the outside, all of those things. She was gutted, and her parents come out and discover her hanging from a tree, and you're like, holy shit, this movie's gonna go there. This just got real. Let's get into it. So I think all of those things add up to me to be one of the greatest openings in horror history, and definitely one of the greatest openings ever for a slasher movie. I mean, I could go on for 20 minutes just about the opening of this movie probably, but let's get through the plot, and I want to give you guys my rating at the end. But from there, we get Billy sneaking into Sydney's room. The Exorcist was on, got me thinking of you. Should have been a dead giveaway into Billy Loomis's mind at that point, right? Of course, her and Billy start making out. Don't Fear the Reaper is playing as they do that, and that's one of our first Halloween references. We get multiple throughout this movie, and if you've heard Kevin Williamson talk about writing this, Halloween was definitely a big influence for him, and I think that comes through. When you watch this as a Halloween fan, for sure, you definitely can tell that, as even the fact that, Billy's last name is Loomis, of course, is another reference to Halloween. From there, her dad comes in, he's going on a trip, blase, continues on the plot. We know she's going to be left alone for the rest of this movie, essentially. But they flash to the school, our first scene at the school, and, when they're doing this great establishing shot of the score kind of kicks in for one of the first times, and it's haunting and ominous, and you get to feel, man, everything is just working with this movie. The score is awesome. There's going to be great needle drops later. The shots were working. The cast is great. The script is phenomenal. And just all of those things go to, build a classic, what we have here with Scream, which leads into one of the best introductions to an ensemble cast of all time as well, in my opinion, as they're, sitting around the fountain. You get them, kind of talking about everything that's been going on. You get a little bit of exposition here as well, as, we learn that Stu Macher, which is Matthew Lillard's character, had dated, Casey Becker, Drew Barrymore's character that was killed in the opening in the past. We also start to get into, other movie references here, where they start to reference other movies, which, like I said, that's something that really hadn't been done a ton before. You get Rose McGowan's character, Tatum Riley, saying the killer could have easily been a female, Basic Instinct. And so you get a Basic Instinct reference there. And I also love how the Billy and Stu interactions here, when you go back and watch them in hindsight, they play so much differently. Like, you get Stu saying, I didn't kill anybody. And, Billy then responding with, nobody said that you did. And, almost kind of a wink and a nod there, when you get to realizing the way that this movie goes, of course. But we get one of our first great Stu lines here as well, which to me, Matthew Lillard, his Stu Macher character, is definitely my favorite character of the entire Scream franchise. So glad that he's back for Scream 7. We'll talk more about that as we proceed. I've talked about it a ton on Movie News Daily, but super excited that he's back, and, we get to see Stu Macher again, it sounds like. And of course, one of his first great lines is, you better live her alone. You get it? Live her alone. just so many great comedic moments throughout this movie. It does a better job of almost any movie since then of balancing both horror and comedy. And so from the school scene, then we flash forward to a scene of Nev at home for the first time. And as we, have the establishing shot of her house, we got that score kicking in again, haunting, ominous, and awesome. Yet again, got to credit that awesome score here in this one moving forward. And as she's at her house, she goes in the house, turns on the TV, We get a news clip, from Gail Weathers, kind of providing us a little bit more exposition and backstory into what happened with Sydney's mom, as we find out, she had been sexually assaulted and murdered, which is a dark backstory and, a lot of trauma there for Sydney involved. And we kind of learned that from the beginning. And then we get Sydney getting her first call from Ghostface in the movie, which is great because to me, like, this is one of the first scenes when you see such clever writing from Kevin Williamson, because Sydney talks about how she doesn't watch scary movies. When the Ghostface asks her, what's your favorite scary movie? And Sydney's like, I don't watch scary movies because it's the killer haunting some girl who always runs up the stairs when she should be running out the front door. And then moments later, when Ghostface pops up, what does Neve Campbell do? That exact thing. Sydney does that exact thing. She, has locked the door so she can't run out the front door. She has to run up the steps. And that's just, one of the great examples of Kevin Williamson's writing in this movie. Let me tell you something that horror movies do that a lot of people think is dumb, and then we're going to go ahead and do it right now. It's just so clever right there. You wouldn't expect it, but also I think it shows that this final girl, Neve Campbell, Sidney Prescott, which will go on to be the final girl in this movie, spoiler alert, but she's so much smarter than your average final girl and kind of, a badass, so to speak, as we see here, and we've learned throughout the franchise since. So anyway, Sydney gets away, goes to her bedroom, locks herself in there, and then who pops up in the window? Billy Loomis. He gives her a hug, tells her it's okay. He drops a cell phone, which it's funny, but, thinking back to 1996, nobody had a cell phone. So, him having a cell phone obviously made him a prime suspect. Sid runs down to the front door, opens it up, and it's, the Ghostface mask being held up by Dewey, which always still gets me and makes me laugh, is that she screams when she sees the Ghostface mask, and then Dewey starts screaming as well. David Arquette's character of Dewey is right up there with me in top characters in the franchise as well, and that's always a great comedy moment. And like I said, love that this franchise, especially this original movie, does a great job of balancing the laughter and the horror. And you get another great moment of comedy when they're in the police station, and Tatum, Rose McGowan's character, Sydney's best friend, who is also Dewey's sister, is trying to leave the police station, and she kind of yells at Dewey and gets them to leave, and Dewey's like, hey, you yelled at me in front of my superior, he's my superior. And then Tatum says, the janitor's your superior. That line always gets me as well. Another great comedic beat. But of course, Sydney goes back to Tatum and Dewey's house, and the killer calls Sydney at their house, and Dewey answers the phone, I think, and says, somebody's on the phone for you or whatever, or it might have been the mom. I can't remember right off. But either way, she answers the phone, and, you hear the Ghostface voice, which shout out to Roger L. Jackson, always doing a great job with that Ghostface voice. He says, poor Billy boyfriend, looks like you fingered the wrong guy. Again, of course, referencing Cotton Weary, who she has, on death row for the murder of her mother. And it's a great touch right there because, Billy's in jail. So at that point, you're like, well, can't be Billy. It's got to be somebody else because they called her tonight while he's in jail. So got to be somebody else, right? You would think. But then moving forward, I talked about the score. I talked about the needle drops, and one of the consistent needle drops through the Scream franchise that started here in the OG was Red Right Hand, and Red Right Hand kicking in for the first time still hits the same, as there's always great needle drops in the Scream franchise, but you always got to expect a little Red Right Hand to be squeezed in there now, since the OG did such a great job of it, and we get it a couple times here in this movie. From there, we get a little bit more backstory on her mom and Cotton when her and Gail have another interaction there after their first interaction when Sid knocks her out, and you get, I'll send you a copy. Bam, bitch went down, Sid, super bitch, all of that. So at the school the next day, or I guess it would be the next day, they get an interaction there, and we learn a little bit more of the backstory, whereas Gail's written a book about, the killing of her mother. She thinks, Cotton Weary is innocent, and, she's like, it doesn't matter what I think, your testimony put him away. He's going to fry. He's on death row. She starts to get the sense a little bit that Sydney is questioning, if Cotton Weary was really the killer, because, Gail talks about an innocent man on death row, a killer still on the loose. And, Sydney says, no, I saw him leave, wearing that coat, that bloody coat that they found later. And Gail, drives home. No, you saw someone leave wearing that coat, and, that they later put in, Cotton Weary's car to frame him. And, so Gail, despite, kind of being a little bit of an antagonist here early in the movie, we do realize, especially, in hindsight, when you go back and watch the movie, Gail's actually really intelligent. She kind of figured this out before anyone else. They'd caught him where he wasn't the person that killed, Sydney's mom. Spoiler alert here before we get to the end. But that's always a great moment there, and it's another great expository scene. And I think this movie does a good job of, providing us some expositions, providing us some backstory to these characters without it feeling that way, with it feeling kind of naturally fitting into, the plot and still moving the story forward. And as we move forward in the plot, I definitely got to mention something else that Scream does a great job of, and that's setting us up with red herrings. Especially the first time that you watch this, you're like, oh, maybe it's him. Oh no, maybe it's him. It's so many different misdirections that they hit you with. One of the first ones being Principal Henry, the Fonz. Henry Winkler. I couldn't think of his name. I can only think of the Fonz. But his character here in this movie, he catches a couple of kids, because there's been kids running around in the Ghostface costume, kind of, pretending to be Ghostface and acting a fool at school. And you see him, threaten them with a pair of scissors. And he even mentions, hanging them from a tree with their guts, on the outside, which is how we saw, Casey Becker die in the opening. And you're like, oh, maybe it's him. So point the finger at him a little bit, make him a little bit of a red herring there in that moment. And there, be multiple characters that they do that with throughout the movie. Another one being the sheriff, because there's a scene in the bathroom where Ghostface pops out and comes after Sydney. And when you see him drop down in that stall, the camera zooms in on his boots. And then later, Dewey's talking to the sheriff, and they zoom in on the sheriff's boots, exact same pair of boots that we saw earlier in the movie. So I think this movie does a great job of setting up potential red herrings to where you don't really know who the killer is going to be. And that's another great aspect of Scream, was up till this point, most of slashers, like Michael Myers was Michael Myers. The shape was the shape. He was the killer. Jason Voorhees was the killer after the first one. And then, of course, Freddy Krueger was the killer in Nightmare on Elm Street. Leatherface was the killer in Texas A&M. This was one of the first slashers with a bit of a murder mystery angle, which would start a trend, of course, for the franchise moving forward. Ghostface could be anyone, which I think is something that sets Scream apart, is you get a murder mystery angle along with your slasher. And this was one of the first movies to essentially do that. So from there, we get the announcement from Principal Henry that all the classes have been suspended. There's a citywide curfew, which of course makes sense with everything going on in the town, but it's also a great way to kind of write away the kids having to go to school when you can just kind of continue with this movie's plot elsewhere, which we learn where elsewhere is going to be as Stu, talks to Sydney and Tatum on their way out of school, talks about his parents being out of town. And so he's going to have a party at his place, which is our third act location. And Stu's house is freaking incredible. By the way, when we get to that third act, we'll talk more about it. But that third act, so nostalgic, with the party angle, with all the different horror movies that they're watching. I could go on and on about that. But from there, of course, we get the Principal Henry death scene, which it's funny because, he's kind of creeping around the school and thinks the kids are messing with him. And he opens, the door into the hallway at one point and says, "Hey, you little shits." And somebody says, "What?" And, they look up and it's Wes Craven, which if you didn't know, that's Wes Craven there pretending to be the janitor. And he's got on the brown hat. He's got on the red and green sweater, clearly referencing his other movie, Nightmare on Elm Street, and a Freddy Krueger reference. And if you didn't get it just from the look, Principal Henry, of course, says, "Oh, no, not you, Fred. Not talking to you, Fred." Just to drive home that Easter egg and that reference, which, like I talked about earlier, that type of stuff hadn't been done before. So at that point, that's just a novelty. And it was really cool with them doing that. So, I wax poetic about everything in this movie: the score, the actors, the writing, the directing. Even the camera work is really good. If you haven't noticed this, pay attention next time that you watch this movie. But when Principal Henry dies, there's a shot zooming in kind of on his eyeball, and you can actually see the ghost face mask reflecting in his eyeball. Just great camera work, great shots. Just everything about this movie is so well done. And from there, after the curfew announcement, we get a needle drop of Alice Cooper's School's Out for the Summer. Another great needle drop here as we continue to talk about some of those throughout. And then one of my favorite scenes in the movie is Randy working at a video store, which, number one, fits perfectly with the character, with Jamie Kennedy's character. And Jamie Kennedy did such a great job playing Randy Meeks in the Scream franchise. So underrated. And in this performance, like his first performance here in the original Scream, he's almost like the audience surrogate. Because if you're watching this, you have a lot of horror movie knowledge, and he's kind of that guy in the movie. He's the guy that knows horror movies. And just seeing him work at a video store, one, is awesome because I miss the hell out of video stores. And like I said, just perfect fit for his character. And so, you get the scene of him and one of his famous quotes right here: "There's a simple formula, a very simple formula. Everybody's a suspect." You get that moment here in the video store. And then you get Stu and Billy interacting with Randy. And when you see that scene, after you watch this movie for the first time, like in hindsight, this movie plays so much differently than it does the first time that you watch it, which nothing ever touches the first time you watch it. Try and figure out the killer, because I don't know about you guys, but I certainly never did. But when you watch it in hindsight, some certain things play differently. And, Billy and Stu toying with Randy in the video store is definitely one of those scenes. From there, we flash to, Tatum, Dewey, and Sydney together. They're talking about how the curfew gives the town a town that dreaded sundown feel. Another horror movie reference. And then we get another great comedy moment. In my personal opinion, one of my favorite comedy moments from this movie that I think is so underrated, which this is when we see the sheriff's boots that I've talked about earlier. But it's so funny because Dewey has an ice cream cone. The sheriff has a cigarette, and he's taking a draw on his cigarette, and every time he does, Dewey matches it with a lick on his ice cream cone. And just that juxtaposition always, never fails to make me laugh here in this scene. But from there, we start to, get into kind of our third act here moving forward. And one of the big turns there is they finally get to, trace the phone calls that have been coming through to Sydney. And once they do, and they trace the calls, they learn that they're coming from Sydney's dad's cell phone. Another great red herring right there. They've set up so many different people, here as potential red herrings as you're trying to figure out who is Ghostface. And that just does a great job of misdirecting you. From there, we head to the party, and as we go to the party, we see kids kind of going to the party, and we get my favorite personal needle drop of this movie, and that's the Youth of America song by Birdbrain that kicks in, because I don't know, something about that moment when that song kicks in and these kids are going to this high school party, it just feels super nostalgic every time. It gets me, man. I love that needle drop and that moment of people heading to this party at Stu's house. And so we get to the party there at Stu's house. And I think another great moment is Randy's brought over a slew of movies, all horror movies, for them to potentially watch at the party, which how cool was that? Watching horror movies at a high school party. We've all been there and done that. I specifically remember watching one of the Screams at a house party back in the day when I was in high school, funny enough. I think it might've been Scream 3, if I remember right. I can't remember right off, but that did happen. And so it's super nostalgic with that. But also you get multiple horror movie references here, because I think he mentions Prom Night, Terror Train, Halloween, a few others. And of course, they end up watching Halloween, which, as I talked about earlier, was a big influence for Kevin Williamson. And what they do in the third act here involving Halloween is so cool. We'll talk more about that momentarily. But I love all the horror movies that they reference as Randy tries to play one for the party. And of course, choosing Halloween is absolutely perfect. Then from there, we get, Tatum in the garage going to get some more beers. We get the Tatum garage death scene, which is an absolute classic as she tries to escape through, the doggy door in the garage. And of course, ends up getting Ghostface raising the door and smashing her in there, which, I know would never really work. That garage door would not raise with the person in it, because by God, garage doors are so finicky, you can't close them if there's a stick in front of them, stuff like that, all those sensors and stuff. But for the movie, it works. And in 1996, I didn't know much about garage doors, so it worked. So I still like that Tatum kill, although logistically may not make the most sense. I still go with it. From there, cut back to the party as they're watching, Halloween. And Randy tells them, the rules. And to me, probably one of the most iconic scenes in horror movie history, definitely in slasher movie history, is Randy explaining the rules. Because, he's talking about the rules to survive a horror movie, and these things had never been called out before. And so it's like from then on, you start to realize, oh, that's what happened in every horror movie, from the 70s and 80s. And, he mentions, you can't have sex. If you have sex, you die in a horror movie. You can't drink or do drugs. If you do that, you die in a horror movie. And you can never say, I'll be right back, because you won't be back, all of those things that he mentioned. And of course he says, only virgins can outsmart the killer in the big chase scene, which yet again is the movie telling you the trope. This is the trope. The virgins can only survive. And guess what? We're going to break that trope, because Sydney's upstairs sleeping with Billy right now, and she's going to be our final girl and survive this movie. So I love that. I love that they say, here's the tropes, and we're going to break them. It's really cool. It's just really clever stuff there. And then we get a Dewey red herring moment as well, as we cut to, him and Gail, and he's talking about, hey, we should walk, through the woods. It's such a beautiful night and stuff like that. And he's like, unless you're scared. And so you're like, first time you see this movie, you're like, is Dewey the killer? Could it be Dewey? All of these things just make you question it. And that's just a credit to the writing from Kevin Williamson. But anyways, flashback into the house after that. And of course, we talked about them, watching Halloween. And in the third act of this movie, the score of Halloween begins to become the score of Scream as well. The fact that the movie's playing on the TV in the film, but that sound is becoming, source for us to where the score of Halloween scoring Scream. I don't know. It's just so smart, so, so innovative. Nobody had ever done anything like that before. And it was really cool. And of course, I mean, you can't top the Halloween score for a horror movie. So having it included during some tense moments is always going to be good. And then I think from there, we get one of the more meta moments, in my opinion, because, Randy Meeks' character, played by who? Jamie Kennedy. He's watching Halloween on the TV. At this point, he's left alone. Everyone else has kind of left the party because they heard about Principal Hembry dying and they dip out. But Ghostface is approaching him from behind the couch. He's watching Halloween. On the TV on Halloween, Michael Myers is approaching behind Jamie Lee Curtis's character. And so what is Randy in Scream telling her? Look behind you, Jamie. Look behind you. Who plays Randy Meeks in Scream? Jamie Kennedy. And as he's saying this, Ghostface is creeping up behind him and he's saying, look behind you, Jamie. And to me, that's 100% intentional to be a meta moment there, because he could have easily said, look behind you, Laurie, which is the character's name in the movie, but he says Jamie, the name of the actor, which is the name of the actor, his name that's playing the Randy character. Just so smart, man. Just so smart. And, that's a touch that probably didn't come until after Jamie Kennedy was cast, but it worked so well. So I don't know if you credit that to Kevin Williamson or Wes Craven, but it's super smart, that moment they were in the movie. And then, of course, before that, they have set up a camera inside. Gail Weathers has to spy on the party. And when she sets up the camera, we find out when she goes back out to the van with her cameraman that there's a 30-second delay on the camera, which is another great piece of writing because that comes into play here because the cameraman sees Ghostface coming up, on Randy, and he's like, look behind you, kid, look behind you. And then all of a sudden Ghostface dips out and the cameraman hops out of the van and looks and the front door's open. And he's like, oh no, 30-second delay. Oh, he's gone. Throat slit by Ghostface. And, they set up that 30-second delay like Chekhov's gun, and it paid off right there in that moment. And then we get a little bit of another smart moment from Neve Campbell's character of Sydney as she talks about, after she had sex with Billy, they're kind of sitting there and just talking a little bit. And it's like she starts to think of stuff in her mind, and she asks, who did you call? Who'd you call when you were in jail? Because you get your one phone call. And she just starts thinking, it'd be super clever if you called me as your one phone call, because as we talked about, she was at Tatum and Dewey's house, got the phone call. So, oh, no way, it could be Billy. He's in jail. But she's starting to think, wait a minute. What if he used his one phone call? So then that leaves us as the audience to question, oh shit, maybe Billy is still involved. But then what happens? Billy says, what do I have to prove? What do I have to do to prove to you that I'm not the killer? And as she's saying that, Ghostface is approaching from behind, spins him around, starts stabbing him. We see him covered in blood and falls to the ground. And at this point, you're like, well, definitely not Billy. Any doubts that I had that it could be Billy that were presented right there, they're taken away. No way this is Billy, right? No way. From there, Stu and Randy show up, at the door as Sydney has a gun, both pleading, he's the killer. No, he's the killer. And Sydney has the best reaction, which is fuck you both, and slams the door on him, which yet again just shows how much they wrote Sydney to be smarter than your average final girl and to be a badass, right? Love Sidney Prescott in these Scream movies. So we get that. She slams the door. All of a sudden, here comes Billy coming out of the bedroom. He's so weak where he's been stabbed. He can't walk. He falls all the way down the steps. Goes to Sydney, says, it's okay. Give me the gun. I got this. Let's open the door. They open the door. It's only Randy there. So, Stu's gone. Randy comes in. Randy says, oh, it's Stu. He's gone mad or something like that. And then we get the great line and the great turn from Skeet Ulrich, whose performance is underrated in this movie. I got to give it to him, man. I thought that his turns were great, especially right here. He gets that kind of sinister look on his face, and he says, we all go a little mad sometimes. And then, of course, shoots Randy and then says, Anthony Perkins, Psycho. So the movie calling out, yes, that's a quote from Psycho. And yet again, more insight into the fact that Billy is, a big horror movie fan. He's now referenced Silence of the Lambs, The Exorcist, Psycho. He's referenced all these throughout the movie. And of course, from there, Sydney goes to run. Stu pops into the kitchen. He uses the voice changer and you realize, oh shit, it's Stu and Billy at this point. And Stu and Billy together, probably still the greatest reveal. Definitely in the Scream franchise, one of the greatest reveals in slashers to me. And their monologue and the moments from here on out Nothing in the franchise has came close to this, in my opinion. Still to this point, the best killers in the franchise, all of that. But you get the exposition continued here where Billy tells, Sydney, she says, you'll never get away with this. He says, tell that to Cotton Weary. You wouldn't believe how easy he was to frame. And then you get one of the great Stu quotes, watch a few movies, take a few notes. It was fun, and you continue to get great Stu Mocker quotes here throughout this ending. Next one being, your mother was no Sharon Stone. So many great Stu lines here in these final scenes. But Stu kind of is led to believe throughout this whole time that there's essentially no motive. And then Billy kind of drops the hammer right here saying, the true motive, which was Sydney's mom sleeping with his father, which caused his mother to leave. And you even get the reaction shot from Stu like, oh shit, I didn't know all that. You know what I'm saying? Which is another great turn in the movie there at that point. And of course, third plan is to frame Sydney's dad, which, was a nice twist as well. We'd already learned that the calls were coming from his cell phone, which they had cloned. And so they more or less, you think they got this all figured out. And their plan is to be the lone survivors. So, they're like, okay, we're going to stab each other. And then you get, Stu, the get it up, let's go, baby moment when Billy stabs him. And then of course, Billy stabbing Stu, and, Sydney mentioned something about them watching too much movies, and you get a great line here, so well written from Kevin Williamson, as Stu says, don't you blame the movies. Movies don't create psychos. Movies make psychos more creative. And so many good lines here that we can quote, throughout this final moment. Of course, they stab each other. Stu's essentially bleeding out at this point. He mentions, I'm feeling a little woozy. I think you cut me too deep. And then Gail pops up at this moment. Looks like she's going to save the day. Safety on the gun is on. So she gets knocked out. Billy comes to her. Looks like he's going to kill her. But then Stu looks back into the kitchen. Sydney's gone. So they come back in to try and find her. She calls them on the phone. She has the voice changer talking to them. At this point, Billy just starts going apeshit, getting pissed. So, he hands the phone to Stu. He talks to her for a second, hands it back to Billy. Billy goes off, throws the phone, hits Stu, and that's when you get the famous line, you hit me with the phone, dick, from Matthew Lillard, which is a great line. And then he gets on the phone and asks Sydney if she really called the police. She says, yeah. He says, my mom and dad are going to be so mad at me, which we've learned since then was an improvised line by Matthew Lillard and one of the most memorable from this movie, as you get so many memorable lines here in this final act. And then to drive home, our Halloween references to Scream here, as we talked about Kevin Williamson being a fan of Halloween. Billy's looking for Sydney. He opens the closet looking for. The camera cuts to Halloween on the TV. What scene is it? Laurie hiding in the closet from Michael Myers. About that time, Sydney bursts out of the closet, stabs Billy, with the umbrella. You're like, okay, Billy's disposed of at this point. Then all of a sudden, here comes Stu running. He attacks Sydney, gets on top of her. I always had a thing for you, Sid. Sid gets him off in your dreams, throws the big tube TV on his head, allegedly killing him. Allegedly. Because we got him coming back. Hopefully it's really him, but he also was supposed to return in the original script for Scream 3. I digress on that. Gail pops back up in, shoots Billy, and says, I remember the safety that time, you bastard, because she had forgot the safety before. Shoots him. At this point, Randy comes back in. So we got Randy, Gail, and Sydney. And then we get one more horror movie reference here as Randy tells him, careful. This is the moment when the supposedly dead killer comes back to life for one last scare, which is something that always happened in, horror movies and slasher movies, but had never really been referenced before until this movie. Another innovative move by Scream, and another move that's so smart in the writing and in this film. But of course, Billy does just that, pops up, and Sydney puts one right in between his eyes and says, not in my movie, which gives Sydney such a great and badass final moment for her and a great button to the movie as well. Perfect. There's not really anything about the OG Scream that I could think of that I would change, right off the top of my head for sure. It's well written, it's well directed, it's well acted, the music is great. The murder mystery aspect, the first time you watch it, it's nearly impossible to figure out the killers, because you might figure out one, but you're definitely not going to suspect that there's two, because that's something that hadn't really been done to that point either. I could go on and on about this, but the best way to sum it up is, from Billy Bob from Varsity Blues, this movie is,
I give it a 10, a fucking 10.
It's perfect, man. If I could give it 11, I would, but it's a 10 out of 10 for me here on the original Scream as we wrap up our first review here in the Scream review series. And I know this one was lengthy as hell, but man, I got a lot to say about this movie. It's incredible. It's, top 5 horror movies of all time for me, maybe top 3, top 4. It's certainly up there with some of my all-time favorites. I put it right up there with the OG Halloween, with Psycho, Black Christmas, Scream. Those are kind of my tops right there. And Scream is so important because, you know, for people that are my age, the slasher genre could have died. I could have never known about slashers if Scream didn't revitalize it and give us our own slasher genre kind of in the more modern era. So it's great. It's as close to, a perfect slasher as you can get, pretty much, in my opinion. And I'll always love the original Scream. It'll always be the best in the franchise. I don't think anything can ever top it or will ever top it. But we'll continue on and review the rest of the franchise as we lead up to Scream 7, which I hope is as phenomenal as it can possibly be. But that's my thoughts on the original Scream here from 1996. I'd love to hear some of yours, though. Drop them in the comments down below. Appreciate those interactions as we continue to try and grow the JC's Movies channel here on YouTube. Look out for the Scream 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 reviews coming at you as we lead up to Scream 7's release later this month in February. Appreciate you guys tuning into this one, and I will catch you on the next one.